So, welcome everyone. My name is Daniela Ozacky, and I'm so happy to see you all, so many friends and colleagues who joined us today for an exciting event as part of the Holocaust and War team of the Holocaust Studies Program at Western Galilee College, entitled January 1943, Total War. We can see the developments of events on the military fronts within the close circle of the Nazi regime and with respect to the continuing escalation of the Holocaust and the final solution of the Jewish question. It is our honor to host three excellent speakers who will share with us their new research, and we will see how it is all actually connected to our topic. As always, I want to remind you that we are recording this session and we will upload it to our website. If you have any questions for our panelists, please write them down on the chat. I want to thank our online team, Dr. Boaz Cohen, the head of the program, Dr. Yaron Pasher, and our moderator, Adi Kantor, and everyone else for the support. And especially I want to thank our speakers today or tonight, and all of you, our audience, for always showing up and be here. We value your contribution to our program. And now Dr. Yaron Pasher will share with us a few opening words. Yaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. I'll just share a PowerPoint here with your permission. Okay, can you see that? Great. Okay, so I'll just make a brief overview before we begin today's conference. On October 23rd, 1942, the British 8th Army, under the command of General Montgomery, launched a massive attack on the German positions at El Alamein front in Egypt. For more than 10 days, a large armored battle took place, at the end of which the British managed to break Romel's army and break through the German positions. The German forces were pushed out of Egypt in November 1942, and the following months, the British occupied Libya, Tunisia, which removed the Nazi danger from the Middle East. Simultaneously with the expulsion of the African Corps from Egypt in November 1942, American forces, as well as British, under the command of General Eisenhower, landed in Morocco and Algeria, taking over these countries as well. The combined forces advanced also towards Tunisia, occupying it in May 1943. And as a result, the Allies controlled all of North Africa and created a base there to organize their forces for attacks aimed at Southern Europe. In October 1942, at the height of the destruction of Polish Jewry, Jan Karski of the Polish underground was ordered to deliver a report on the situation of the occupied Poland to the Polish government. Just by the way, in December 1942, you can see the face of the Grand Alliance. Churchill comes to Moscow, is greeted by Molotov and Shaposhnikov, and this is the beginning of what we call the turn of the tide. So at the same time, a month before, in October 1942, Jan Karski of the Polish underground was ordered to deliver a report on the situation of the occupied Poland, what was happening in occupied Poland, to the Polish government in exile situated in London. The situation of the Jews in Poland was to be one section of that report. With great risk to his life, he was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and to the Belgian concentration camp. Witnessing the horrors that he saw there marked him deeply and propelled him to become not only the messenger of the Polish underground, but to concentrate on giving voice to the suffering of the Jewish people. Karski arrived in London on November 15, 1942, and immediately met with Polish leaders, and the next day with British government ministers, including Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Karski's testimony, together with the testimony of survivors from Poland who testified in Israel at the time, and the confirmation of the US Deputy Secretary of State to Stefan Weiss, confirmed that the news of the previous 16 months indicated a Nazi plan to murder all the Jews under their control. Public pressure was created in the United States and Great Britain, and also in the Polish government in exile, to express an official Allied response. The result was the Allied Joint Declaration of December 17, 1942. When the news about the murder of the Jews began to appear in the headlines in newspapers, on December 17th, a joint declaration of the Allies in Moscow, London, and Washington was published at the same time. The statement confirmed that there is a plan to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe and that hundreds of thousands of Jews have already been murdered. The statement also said that the Allied governments pledged to ensure that those responsible for this crime do not escape punishment. The importance of the joint declaration and the Allies' recognition of the terrible fate of the Jews and the crimes against them. Furthermore, in January 1943, the Casablanca Conference was held. Roosevelt and Churchill were the key players at the conference, while Stalin was unable to attend. The Casablanca Conference of 1943 was focused on deciding how the Allies would coordinate the war. Two important decisions came out of that conference. First, having established a foothold in North Africa, US and British forces would next launch an invasion of Italy. The second, and arguably more important, the Allies agreed on a policy of unconditional surrender by the Axis powers. They stated the desire to achieve the complete defeat of the ideology of Nazism, fascism, and not engage in negotiations for peace that might give impression the Axis could have won the war. This stated goal ensured that there would be no negotiated peace or separate peace between Germany and the US and Germany and Great Britain, influencing also any negotiations whatsoever on saving Jewish lives from Nazi hands. At the end of 1942, when 2/3 of the quota of Jews had already been sent to the death, the railway service to the Ukraine collapsed, and the SS had to stop the transports to the camps for a month from December 15, 1942 to January 20, 1943, despite Himmler's plea to officials of the Reichsbahn to prevent the halt, since these were the days of the Stalingrad battle. The halt of the transports from mid-December was too little and too late to save Sixth Army under General Paulus's command. The German Sixth Army, under the command of Paulus, surrendered at Stalingrad the 2nd of February, 1942. 3 weeks earlier, on January 12, 1943, a major Soviet offensive began from the Don River towards the Donets River, in which the important city of Kharkov was captured, among others. Further north, the Russians took back the big city and the important railway junction at Kursk. To the west, a large enclave was created south of Oyrol and north of Belgorod, which remained in German hands, but the Soviet progress was halted. From mid-February to the end of March 1943, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein led a successful counteroffensive south of Kursk and recaptured Kharkov, even though his forces were outnumbered by 1-5 by the Soviets. This finally left the Kursk enclave as the next obvious target for the German, turning into the Great Battle of Kursk, which would take place in the summer that same year, 1943. Finally, Germany was at the stage of total war. This long speech, of course, by Joseph Goebbels is also his most famous. It was delivered on 18th of February, 1943 to a large but carefully selected audience in Berlin. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended, and the true seriousness of the war was evident to everybody. Goebbels wanted the speech to build popular enthusiasm for the war and also to convince Hitler to give him greater powers in running the war economy. Albert Speer reports talking with Goebbels afterwards, quote, "Except for Hitler's most successful public meetings, I had never seen an audience so effectively roused to fanaticism. Back in his home, Goebbels astonished me by analyzing what had seemed to be purely emotional outbursts in terms of its psychological effect much as an experienced actor might have done. He was also satisfied with his audience that evening. Quote, did you notice they reacted to the smallest nuance and applauded at just the right moments? It was a politically best trained audience you can find in Germany. Goebbels had used the concluding quotation of the speech, now people rise up and let the storm break loose. Adi, would you like to introduce our first speaker for today?
Yes, thank you very much, Yaron. And again, thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to introduce our first speaker tonight, Professor Thomas Weber. Professor Weber is Professor of History and International Affairs, as well as a visiting fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He also holds position at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn, and at the Center for European, Russian, and Euro-Asian Studies at the Monkey School for Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. His expertise pertains to authoritarian populism and the threat it poses to democracy, inter and interstate conflict and conflict resolution since the 19th century, processes of politicization, radicalization, transformation, and regime change. He's the author of the following books: Lodge Ghetto Album, a collection of photographs by Henrik Ross, Our Friend the Enemy, Hitler's First War, and his latest book from 2017, Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi, which was El Mundo's top 10 bestseller, and also was translated in several languages. Professor Weber will talk to us today about Hitler's Crisis-Genocide Nexus, revisiting the origins of the Shoah and total war. I'd like to remind the audience, of course, you're all very welcome to write questions in the chat while Professor Weber holds his lecture, and I'll do my best to represent all the questions. Please, Professor Weber, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Even though obviously the topic is a dire one, I'm so delighted to be back, at least virtually, in Western Galilee. Thank you so much to Adi for the introduction. Thank you so much, Daniela, and everyone else at Western Galilee College for hosting me today and for always putting on such exciting events. What I'm going to talk about today is how we get from, I guess, the origins of the radicalizations of, I guess, the top dogs of the Third Reich to 1943, to total war and genocide. I'll be looking at Hitler's Crisis-Genocide Nexus, and in doing so, I'm trying to revisit the origins of the Shoah and total war. This already started with a request from anti-Semitism studies. They asked me whether I could write a piece about Hitler's anti-Semitism. Of course, I was delighted to say yes, but I also really faced a problem because as I finally got down to writing the piece, I just finished writing my chapter about Hitler and anti-Semitism for the Cambridge History of the Holocaust. So I thought, what am I going to say that is actually not exactly the same? And so what then crossed my mind was, because I just kind of, everyone was dealing with diagnosis, a problem with the problems of genocide, that I really wanted to revisit the question of the nexus of Hitler and the quest for permanent security, because I don't really want to get into kind of the more political discussions about Dirk's book, but this kind of idea of the link of genocide and the pursuit of security is something that rhymed with something that I had written about myself in Becoming Hitler, where I had presented anti-Semitism as a means to an end, as a function of something else, which I thought in a way I really needed to tease out a bit more, but I also felt that that I wasn't really sure whether the permanency or permanent security is the right kind of term. Even though I'd used the term, I had used ideas similar to that in Becoming Hitler, because I started to realize that Hitler, at least in private, did not seem to think that permanent security is possible. So I thought, let's try to see about these ideas of the connections between anti-Semitism in Hitler and permanent security. But what I also did do at the same time, as I was starting to write this, I was reading this little booklet by Beatrice de Graaf, Crisis, which is about really the crisis response in the Netherlands. So really has supposedly nothing to do with the topic I'm talking about. But reading this little elegant essay was really kind of an eye-opener because it kind of really reminded me of the role of crisis and crisis perception, of a perception of polycrisis in radicalizing people, and that the responses to crisis often make crisis worse or create new crisis in the first place. And I really started to realize in reading Beatrice de Graaf's essay that this had kind of been the missing piece in my presentation of the emergence of Hitler's anti-Semitism, and also in explaining why there was, as I believe, in my kind of neo-intentionalist interpretation of Hitler's anti-Semitism, why there was this drive towards genocide. So what I then started to do is I started to chart out how Hitler had spoken about crises over the years. The product is a forthcoming article for anti-Semitism studies called Germany in Crisis, Hitler's Anti-Semitism as a Function of Existential Anxiety and a Quest for Sustainable Security. Let me just briefly give you kind of a short version of what I'm trying to argue in the piece. For one, as I've already indicated, that there's a utilitarian and functional drive between Hitler's anti-Semitism, both in its emergence, but also in the way it was sustained. And the argument is that Hitler's political and proto-genocidal anti-Semitism was a function of the existential anxiety he felt about what he perceived as the greatest polycrisis for centuries and his ensuing quest for sustainable security, not permanent security, but sustainable security. So regaining security lay at the center of his politicization, radicalization, as well as of all his actions once in power. So my contention in the piece is that three ingredients had to come together to produce Hitler's genocidal anti-Semitism. The first element was an awareness of and a belief in and an anxiety about the existence of an existential, national, and international all-encompassing crisis. Second, a linking of Jews to that crisis. And third, a translation of that link into a program of total solutions and a quest for sustainable security. So the goal of his anti-Semitism was to overcome a life or death mega crisis as to be able to return subsequently to conventional pursuit of security. So it was not to produce permanent security for eternity, because Hitler did not think that that was possible. So let me try to unpack this a little bit in the about 14 minutes or so that I have left. So let's start with the utilitarian and functional drive. So rather than being in his self-perception an expression of primordial hatred, Hitler's anti-Semitism, I argue, resulted from his quest for enduring security and national survival. So often when we read about Hitler and the Holocaust, and the kind of anti-Semitism is suddenly there. Suddenly, Hitler is full of revenge, and he wants to take revenge for whatever the First World War. But no one really explains why there was this feeling of revenge, nor, and maybe more importantly, do people take seriously that Hitler himself did actually not think that he was driven by emotions. In fact, he says time and time again, this is not about emotions, and anti-Semitism of emotions will not get us anywhere. So as a result of that, Hitler embarked on a quest to understand why Germany lost the war and how the country should be recast so it never faces a calamity of that kind again. And this led him to crisis awareness and an attempt to figure out how to overcome that crisis rather than to engage in revenge. So this means that we need to look at the role of crisis awareness and of existential anxiety in the emergence of Hitler's political and proto-genocidal anti-Semitism. Because Hitler was thus seeking not piecemeal or reactive solutions to security challenges, but sustainable security for generations to come. And security, after all, was paramount for him. It was the highest political goal in his eyes. Security was the prism through which Hitler looked at the world. Regaining security lay at the heart of his politicization and radicalization, as well as of all of his actions once in power. As Hitler put it in a speech in September of 1938, the security of the nation trumps everything else. So let's look at the role of crisis awareness. So when I talk about crisis awareness, this is not about any crisis. This is about do or die crises. This is about crisis as a state of being, the belief that a crisis could lead to the wiping out of oneself and of one's group. So Hitler's goal then became the delivery of Germany and Europe from that crisis. And if you chart out on how he speaks about crisis over the years, you see that he talks all the time about our folk has been shattered by crises without end. He talks about the crisis of our time, the international crisis, the European crisis, and the gravest crisis in Europe in many centuries. So he's really saying this is not just like anything that people have experienced, but this is something graver than the world has experienced for half a millennium. And it would lead to the annihilation of both Germany and Europe, unless the root causes of that crisis were eliminated. So Hitler saw it therefore as his mission to overcome this crisis and to give people a renewed sense of security. So Hitler's linking of annihilation and crisis is highly significant as it explains his existential anxiety about the crisis he thought to be witnessing, as well as his decision to enter politics. His linking of annihilation and crisis indicated that Hitler believed countries were sucked into the all-encompassing and existential crisis of his time, had a choice: either face annihilation themselves or annihilate the forces behind the crises and survive. And this could, and I think one of the reasons why it could actually be so successful in Germany was also because of the role of crisis awareness in interwar Germany. And for this article, I did n-gram analyses of crisis awareness in different European languages. And what's really interesting here is that while prior to the First World War, crisis talk, of course, had existed and actually existed more in other countries than in Germany, it was really the relative change after the First World War that set Germany apart from other countries. It was that this kind of a sudden and radical change in the perception of reality that set Germany apart from a lot of other European countries. And what needed to, of course, happen next is the linking of Jews to crisis. So for crisis awareness and anxiety in the form of the belief of the existence of an existential, all-encompassing, do-or-die crisis to translate into genocidal anti-Semitism, there needed to occur in the mind of Hitler an identification of Jews as the main producers of that threat and as causal agents of that crisis. So it was an existential anxiety about the mega crisis that Hitler believed Germany to be experiencing that made him receptible in the aftermath of the First World War to radical and proto-genocidal anti-Semitism, and for his anti-Semitism to mutate into something that lay at the center of his of making sense of the world, and also of something that was proto-genocidal. So it was in 1919 that this linking of Jews to crisis occurred, whether or not Hitler may have harbored anti-Semitic ideas before. And here we also really need to look at how, not just for Hitler, but for people, at least in Europe, there was a radical change in the 19th century of who was blamed for crises. Until the 19th century, until well into the 19th century, crises tended to be seen as God-made, as natural disasters, where ultimately Jews maybe were blamed for exploiting those crises, but they were not seen as lying at the heart of that crisis, of having created that crisis. Those kind of crises were God-made, and it was generally perceived as God's punishment. But with that view gone, crises were suddenly human-made, at least ones that were not just pure natural disaster. And that opened the floodgates for people in moments of these mega crises of blaming other humans for these crises. And this then made it, of course, so attractive, not just for Hitler, but for so many Europeans, to turn towards the Jews. Of course, they could latch onto a 2,500-year-old tradition of looking at Jews to make sense of the problems of their time, but now it could be linked to the Jews being the causal agents of that very crisis. So and we can see this linking of Jews as causal agents in Hitler's speeches time and time again. So for instance, Hitler gave a speech in 1937 in which he charged Jews with having created a crisis that was, quote, the greatest menace with which the culture and civilization of the human race has been threatened since the collapse of the state of antiquity, unquote. Elsewhere, he said, the attack of the Jews is so extensive that it draws nearly all of the functions of life into the sphere of its actions. The duration of this fight with the Jews is unforeseeable. So while Hitler did no longer see crises as an act of God, as had earlier generations, religion had actually not disappeared. It was reimagined by Hitler as a political force, because he presented crisis awareness in apocalyptic forms, and Hitler presented the fight for Germany's survival in eschatological and millennial terms. And in fact, in this kind of little other book that I've recently brought out, Als die Demokratie starb, I'm really trying to do something that I've never done before and take political religion seriously, not in terms of making sense of all totalitarian regimes, but rather as understanding not the orthodoxy of National Socialism, but the orthopraxy, the ethically right behavior of National Socialist praxis, and of how Hitler used this National Socialist orthodoxy to promise redemption to the nation, to would-be supporters, and to people who were engaging in this action, and therefore eliminating this Jewish threat. The Jewish origins of this political crisis then became part of the National Socialist orthopraxy of saving Germany, of bringing redemption. So following the inner logic of Hitler's arguments, the linking of the Jews to the existence of a total and all-encompassing existential crisis called for a total and permanent solution to that crisis, which also, of course, suited Hitler's psychological mindset. And this led to total solution as a precondition for returning to sustainable security. So again, this was not about revenge or hatred as far as Hitler was concerned. It was about addressing the root causes of that crisis. And here, I think we can also really see the developmental logic of this thinking towards genocide, which again is, I think, why it's wrong to somehow to argue that there is no direct line from Hitler's 1919 anti-Semitism to 1943 or to genocide. Because we have in this thinking about the Jews, the developmental logic towards anti-Semitism, towards eliminationist anti-Semitism. As a result, Hitler broke with centuries-old crisis response traditions and he presented now the state. So he presented this as a policy challenge, and he tackled the state with solving it. And as Hitler saw the Polish crisis of his time as a human crisis, a human-made crisis for which he held Jews and Germans who supposedly had appropriate Jewish ideas responsible, he thus advocated the pursuit of a very modern crisis response strategy leading to genocide. So Hitler laid out the policy responses that were required, according to him, to overcome Germany's existential crisis. In his articles and letters, he proposed a comprehensive national security strategy revolving around addressing the two primary reasons of Germany's purported weakness that he had identified in 1919, the supposedly pernicious influence of Jews in the Jewish spirit and insufficient territory, manpower, and resources. In drawing up his national security strategy, Hitler advocated total and final solutions to the existential Polish crisis of early 20th century Europe. It remains to be seen, however, if final solution of this kind aim to overcome merely specific Polish crises or to herald in a totally new form of human existence. There has been a tendency among scholars to argue for the latter and to conclude that Hitler aimed to achieve a kind of German-style end of history, which I don't think is the case. I should also say that maybe we can, I don't really have time to go into this at the moment, we're talking about this developmental logic, is that in fact, Hitler already sketched out in private and semi-private settings in the early 1920s, preferred final solutions where where he was basically spelling out that it would be best to kill all the Jews. He was just saying it's not possible. Therefore, he was willing or ready to settle for second best final solutions, but he would always settle for the most radical final solution that was possible at any given moment in time, because it promised the best chance of survival. It promised the best way of overcoming this existential crisis, which again, if you take this serious, this crisis talk, this existential crisis, it's not a given that Germany and Europe will survive. So therefore, Germany and Europe can only survive if the most radical solution that is possible is being pursued. So Jews had to be wiped out for Germany to be safe again and to produce a sustainable state of security. But I want to just finally very briefly talk about that. I think this was about creating not permanent but sustainable security, because even though Hitler was using kind of the rhetoric in language in public speeches about that sounded as a little bit as if there was this kind of a national socialist nirvana, or this kind of idea that that this would be a totally new kind of existence. As we know from how he talked about backstage, he did not actually think that this was possible. Behind the scenes, he was basically saying, look, nothing is permanent, there will be a return to conflict. And so he's basically fleshing out there that this was really about the Shoah and Second World War, total war, is about eliminating the source at the core of this existential crisis. And if Germany and Europe make it, then they can return to a more traditional pursuit of security, thus sustainable security, rather than the kind of Dirk Moser style, or as I've said myself, in Becoming Hitler, permanent security. So to just conclude, Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitic politicization, radicalization, and his subsequent actions as a politician and a leader were thus a function of his belief in the existence of an existential life or death polycrisis. That crisis had made him receptive to radical anti-Semitism, and had made him open to a life of anti-Semitic practice. His proto-genocidal anti-Semitism was thus utilitarian in origin, born out of crisis awareness, turning into existential anxiety. The irony and tragedy of Hitler's radicalization and the emergence of his genocidal anti-Semitism thus is that it was fueled by an attempt to respond to and overcome what many believe was the greatest crisis to hit Germany in centuries. Yet it ended up actually creating what it thought to eliminate, and what in reality never had existed in the first place. It thus produced the greatest crisis of the 20th century, unleashing war and genocide on an unprecedented level. As Beatrice de Graaf put it in the essay that I showed you at the beginning, the 20th century showed that disasters and risks were not only solved by people, but also produced. The great social engineering projects of the 20th century, fascism, National Socialism, and communism, led to death and destruction on a hitherto unprecedented industrial scale. And now I hope that Bas Willems in the audience will not check up on my translation from the Dutch. And I thank you all for listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Okay, we will have some more. Thank you, Professor Weber. We will have time later on for some Q&As and conversation. I'd like to introduce our next speaker for today, Dr. Joel Zisenwine. Dr. Zisenwine earned his PhD from the Hebrew University in 2010. The title of his thesis was British Intelligence Reports on Nazi Germany between 1942 and 1945. Between 2008 and 2018, Dr. Zisenwine directed the Deportations Database Research Project called Transports to Extinction at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. And since 2018, he has headed the Righteous Among the Nations Department. Today, Dr. Zisenwine will speak about the Allied Declaration of December 1942. What did they actually know? Joel, please.
Okay. Thank you, Yaron. Thanks, Yaron. I'm experiencing a minor technical problem, so you might see me looking aside at a piece of paper I have here. I apologize ahead of time.
Okay.
Just want to share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see it?
Yes, but maybe you can enlarge it a bit.
Yes, I'm trying to. Nope.
Okay, so just go ahead. It's okay.
Okay, sorry about this. Okay. It doesn't seem to be responding. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I might be repeating a little from Yaron's introduction. The events of November 1942 provided a glimpse of optimism and hope in the ongoing military struggle against Nazi Germany. So we mentioned before Operation Torch, the amphibian landing of the Allied troops on the beaches of North Africa that were followed by the British triumph at El Alamein, which, according to Prime Minister Churchill, marked the end of the beginning. These military gains in North Africa were followed shortly afterwards by the Red Army's counteroffensive thousands of miles away at the gates of Stalingrad. Now, the events that followed in the next few weeks were of a horrific nature and displayed, in retrospect, what one historian, a colleague of mine, David Zilberklang, once referred to as the conflicting timelines of World War II and the Holocaust. The same period featured I would say, an accumulation or an influx of a series of public reports that had reached the Allied intelligence services and Jewish leadership in Palestine, mandatory Palestine, the so-called Yeshuv, and led to the official declaration of December 17th about the mass murder of European Jewry. I'll just mention that at the same time, you can see here, the 3 days of mourning were declared by the Yeshuv in mandatory Palestine at the time. Now, I'm going today to mainly focus on the, I would say the intelligence perspective of knowledge about the Holocaust or the final solution in the months leading up to the Allied declaration. Now, when we discuss in general, when we discuss the Allies' knowledge of the Holocaust, there are, I would say, several key questions that we usually address. And the first one is, what did they know? And when we talk about what did they know, first of all, we have to really ask, who are we referring to? Intelligence work is divided, it's compartmentalized. You usually have only a few players that actually have the full picture of the events unfolding. There are different types of collecting methods, different techniques applied, and therefore it would be, it's very hard to assume that unless very few people, unless they're on the top, can really understand the full magnitude of the events. So first of all, I mentioned some of the key questions that we have. One of them is, what did they know? And I would add to that, what did they understand? We often look at specific fragments of documentation and say, look, they knew everything. It's far more complex than that. And then I would add, in the words of Professor Yuda Bauer from an article published years ago, when did they know? At what point in time did they actually have a complete picture of the events? I would also mention who knew. As I mentioned before, not every person in the intelligence community has the full comprehension of the events unfolding. And then, of course, there's the other question that I would say usually extends beyond historical discourse, and is, what did they do? There's always an issue here, or an accusatory tone that's accompanied to this topic of the Allies and the Holocaust. What did they do with the information? The question of what did they do is usually referred to the consumers of the intelligence, that is the senior policymakers and the decision makers. What did they actually do with the intelligence that was acquired? Now, Holocaust-related historiography generally emphasizes the revelation and publicity given to several reports during the course of 1942 as having a supposed profound and dramatic effect on Allied governments and public degree of knowledge and comprehension of the final solution. I'll just run through a few of the more known reports that arrived in the free world in 1942. The first one in January 1942, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov announced or referred to the murder of Soviet citizens. However, the precise identity of many of the victims was, I would say, sort of vague or hidden. A few months later, historiography often refers to the Bund, that is the Jewish Socialist Party in Poland, the Bund report, which reached London. Now, this report, for the first time, provided numbers that were in the hundreds of thousands. Beyond that, as you can see marked in red, they also mentioned the use of a gas chamber. I see this as sort of an escalation in the magnitude of the final solution and what is being reported abroad. However, it is not at this point, at least I don't think that the British intelligence referred or provided a lot of credibility to this report. And of course, several months later in August 1942, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, representative of the Jewish World Congress in the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland, Gerhard Riegner, sends out 2 telegrams from an unknown source at the time. He received information about, he received alarming reports stating that in the Fuhrer's headquarters, there's a plan to wipe out Jewry, European Jewry. He also referred to prussic acid. So again, you can see how the news about the final solution is unfolding. However, one has to remember the time gap. Mass shootings of Soviet Jews began in the summer of 1941. And here we are a year and a month later, And while arguably more than 1 million Jews have already been murdered, there are still reports that hesitating about the credibility of the sources here, it doesn't, they're not sure if the news is true. And you can see the time, again, the gap. Not only that, in August 1942, one must remember that the Operation Reinhard camps were already in full activity, all three of them, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau as well. And they are, the news or the information being, or intelligence collected is months away. In November 1942, as I think Yaron mentioned this before in his introduction, there were two other events that are important to the arrival of news about the final solution. First of all, we have a group, there was a swap or an exchange of 69 Jews that were residents of Palestine that by coincidence were just caught up with the war in 1939 while they were on private visits in Poland. And they were exchanged for German citizens or of German descent in Palestine at the time. And they arrived at the Athlete detention camp and were interrogated or interviewed by members of the board of the Jewish community, and apparently also by members of the representatives of the Polish government in exile, and most likely also by members of British intelligence. Now, the gradual accumulation, and as Yaron also mentioned before, we also have the arrival of Jan Karski, member of the Polish underground in Great Britain in the month of November. So you can all see how this is all unfolding in this month. And this led to the publication of the report on mass extermination of Jews in German-occupied Poland by the government in exile. Now, just a few words about this report. There are a few details that I think should be mentioned. First of all, you can see some would argue that maybe the details aren't all that important. So on the one hand, they do mention the use of poison gas. They also mention electrocution, which was also used. The methods of mass murder were not widely known. One could argue that this isn't actually all that significant. However, some of the features or unique features of the final solution deal with gassing. And you can see here at this stage, at the end of 1942, reliable information still hasn't reached neither the Polish government in exile nor British intelligence. You can also take a look and see that they're also mentioning the deportation of 250,000 Jews deported from the Warsaw Ghetto. This event too began in July 1942, and now here we are in December, and this is when reliable information reached British intelligence. So again, you can see the time gap. All of this ultimately led to the declaration of December 17, 1942. We all know about this. Secretary of State Anthony Eden was asked by Member of Parliament Sidney Silverman, and he read the following announcement and declaration. Among that, he referred to barbarous and inhumane treatment to which Jews are being subjected in German-occupied Europe. He also, one of the key words used here is Hitler's intent to exterminate the Jewish people of Europe. So you can see how this is unfolding. This isn't just now a report about some massacre in one location or the other, but he's referring to a much larger number. He's talking about hundreds of thousands of women and children. Now, despite the public attention that was given to the fate of Jews at the end of 1941, I would argue that, at least within the frameworks of the intelligence community and senior policymakers, the end of 1942 should not be viewed as a turning point or a watershed, but rather it's just one step, though an important one, in a long process, which only eventually led to the full comprehension of what German historian Hans Mommsen once referred to as an unthinkable event. Now, the process of collecting and analyzing intelligence about the fate of European Jews started prior to 1942 and continued to the very end of World War II and I would even argue up to the preparation of the Nuremberg trials. Some of the particular features of the final solution, as known to us today, and have even to a certain extent come to symbolize the Holocaust, were not known at the end of 1942. The intelligence community was not fully aware of the exact methods of murder, as I mentioned before, names and locations of death camps, and even the term death camp had not come into use yet. Or also with the exact scale of mass deportations as well. In the following years, some of this information either did not reach collecting agencies or was met with disbelief and disregard. On the other hand, various intelligence organizations had some knowledge and understanding, if only partial, of what was actually unfolding. As I mentioned before, 1942 is often marked by historians as the year in which information about the Holocaust reached the free world. However, the picture that we have today is slightly different. This has to do with the declassification process that took place in the United Kingdom and US National Archives in the late 1990s. This process declassified millions of documents and led to we have a different perspective now about intelligence that the Allies had prior to 1943 about the final solution. In fact, already in 1979, Francis Hinsley, in his monumental official study of British intelligence in the Second World War, revealed that during the summer months of 1941, the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park, I'm sure you're all familiar with the British breakthrough in deciphering codes of the Enigma machine. While they were monitoring the advancements of the German military and German police forces in the USSR during the summer of 1941, following Operation Barbarossa, they managed to decode reports of German order police, the Ordnungspolizei. Now, years later, when these reports were declassified, it turned out that indeed some of these reported that mass shootings of Jewish population along the Eastern Front. Now, these sources were declassified in the late 1990s, and since then, several historians, among them Richard Brightman, Nicholas Terry, have studied these reports in depth. They also had debated some of the exact meanings about what this actually meant at the time that these reports were decoded and what you could understand from them. We know that only a small group of top intelligence personnel and decision makers, such as Prime Minister Churchill, had access to these reports. Now, in September 1941, Nigel de Grey, deputy director of the Government and Code and Cipher School, observed the following. The fact that the police are killing all Jews that fall into their hands should now be sufficiently appreciated. It is not therefore proposed to continue reporting these butcheries unless so requested. Now, de Grey's comment should be appreciated within the context of intelligence work and at the time of a strategical hazardous period. Now, in general, intelligence work is carried out in accordance with a set of priorities set out by the policymakers. The main concern during the summer fall months of 1941 was the military situation on the Eastern Front. German occupation policies, as this was interpreted at the time, which included mass shootings of Jews, received lower priority. Now, early knowledge of this mass killings on the Eastern Front was not widely shared. However, reports about atrocities carried out by Germans in Poland and Czech had reached British Foreign Office since 1939. In some cases, but some of these reports were met by doubts of senior British officials. Now, in a memorandum written by some experts from the Chatham House that were employed by the British Foreign Office, who submitted periodic reports, this one from the end of 1941 was titled "The Present Position of World Jewish Jewry," with a particular reference to Eastern Europe. And the author made the following observation about possible demographic changes in Eastern Europe under German occupation. In the first place, the population of German-occupied territories may be considerably diminished, and the Jewish population will certainly show a relative decline. Now, it is highly unlikely that these experts had access to the decoded German reports. However, there seems to be some kind of understanding about German intent at this time. So here comes the question: if so much information is gathered, why isn't it more widespread? Why isn't it being made public? Now, a lot of this has to do with priorities during wartime and issues of national security. What do you do with such secret intelligence? It is highly unlikely that you're going to make this public. In November 1942, the British ambassador to the Czech exiled government, Philip Nichols, asked the Foreign Office whether it could send a report to the Czech government that contained intelligence about the massacre of Jews in the East, as they were reported by two Slovak army officers. Now, Foreign Office official Frank Roberts answered, "There is nothing in this report which would be undesirable for us to pass on to the Czechoslovaks. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it is wise to begin handing reports of this kind to the Allied governments. They have a definitive object in showing us their reports, since they wish us to receive a certain impression of conditions at home. We have no such object, and if we only communicate an occasional anodyne report, we run the risk of appearing to the Allied governments concerned either extremely secretive or extremely ill-informed. In the circumstances, I think it would be perhaps better that you should not pass this report on." Now, 5 days after the declaration of December 17, 1942, and again, this is something that was made public, there was a campaign on the BBC. The War Cabinet's Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, the JIC, discussed the coordination of blacklists of individuals guilty of atrocities. Now, I just want to mention something about this. It doesn't seem at this stage, and not before that, that there was some kind of intent or it wasn't made a high priority to gather information about mass murder of Jews. There was interest in gathering information for a future objective, and that is for possible legal measures after the war. So that's why they're blacklisting individuals. And at this stage, the chairman of the committee, senior official, Foreign Office official, Victor Cavendish-Bentnick, pointed out that some of the best evidence on this subject derived from sources which might make it undesirable to make use of. In other words, what's he saying? We have sources that are very secret. It's quite clear to what he's referring, and I'll just explain in a second. We can't use them right now. We can't make it public. So he's obviously referring to the reports from Bletchley Park, and another important source, very secret as well, that's received quite a lot of attention in recent years, are the transcripts of conversations of German POWs, particularly generals, but also soldiers and officers of lower ranks, where their cells were apparently tapped and they were recorded while discussing various topics. So the following report, so this is just to show you, was received on December 17th, 1942. One of the speakers was General von Thoma, one of the senior officers of the Africa Corpus, who was who was caught. And you can see here that he and a lower ranking officer, a fighter pilot, are discussing events that obviously they either had access to radio broadcasts or to newspapers. And as you can see, the topic is the mass murder of Jews. So Fontoma refers to the English. They are making the most of the Jewish question. It's quite easy to find evidence. It is in fact just as they say. It was horrible in Russia, but it wasn't the army. It was the Gestapo, Himmler's men. I'll just mention as a side comment here, very often you can learn a lot about German public opinion and trends through these conversations. So they're referring to, or they're trying to, I would say, whitewash the Wehrmacht. And then the other participant in the conversation says the worst incidents happened in Kiev, I believe. Again, this is a year and 3 months after the massacre at Babi Yar. And we also know from other sources, I've seen Victor Klemperer write about this in his diary. They're referring to the mass murder in Kiev. And then Fontoma responds, everywhere. The whole lot were put up against the wall and machine gunned. That about women and children is correct. All these stories are certainly with what I've heard from reliable people. And then you can also see the fighter pilot asks, were they Russian Jews? And he says all kinds. This is something, by the way, that surfaces in a lot of the conversations. They distinguish very often between German Jews and Jews of other descent. So again, all of this takes place the exact same day as the Allied Declaration. Now, as we mentioned beforehand, and I'll conclude with this, the reporting about the final solution continues in 1943 and 1944. And at some point in 1943, during the summer, there's preparation in the Foreign Office to write another or follow-up declaration on the Declaration of December. And I mentioned it before, the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Victor Cavendish-Bentnik, is referring to the use of gas. And he says the following: it is true that there have been references to the use of gas chambers in other reports, but these references are usually, if not always, been equally vague. And since they have concerned the extermination of Jews, have usually emanated from Jewish sources. Personally, I have never really understood the advantage of gas chambers over the machine gun or equally simple starvation methods. We do know that the Germans are out to destroy the Jews of any age unless they are fit for manual labor. I think we weaken our case against the Germans by publicly providing credence to atrocity stories for which we have no evidence. The term atrocities is used a lot by German intelligence. It has a connotation in British press for unreliable or exaggerated reports. I'll also just say that Cavendish-Bentnik also referred in this or commented in this memo that both the Poles and the Jews are known to exaggerate. So there's also a degree of bias or stereotypes, and one could even say some form of anti-Semitism in these reports. Now, details about the final solution continue to reach Allied intelligence, mainly British, in a fragmentary manner. As often in the case with intelligence in general, it does not appear that the intelligence community devised at any time an operation or activities specifically designed to acquire information about the fate of Jews. This conclusion can also be applied to top members of the American intelligence. Alan Dulles, for instance, the chief head of OSS office in Bern, Switzerland, very rarely reported about the final solution. Pardon me here for a second. Okay, to conclude, the reporting about the final solution continued until 1945. The Declaration of 1942 can be viewed as a important and significant milestone in a ongoing process. However, when you look at the immense amount of documents about the final intelligence documentation about the final solution, what you really see is ultimately the final solution remained buried in piles of records till the end of World War II and for many years afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we are moving to the final speaker of today. Dr. Alexandra Lohse joined the Mandel Center at USAGMM in 2017 as an applied research scholar and editor of the 6th volume of the museum's encyclopedia of camps and ghettos on extermination, labor, and transit camps for Jews. In 2020, she started serving as senior editor, coordinating the work of in-house and external researchers and volume editors to complete the encyclopedia series. Dr. Lohse also worked at the National Archives and served as staff historian for the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. Dr. Lohse's research focuses on German society during World War II and on the nature and endurance of popular support for the Nazi regime during the final war years. Her book, Prevail Until the Bitter End, Germans in the Waning Years of World War II, was published at Cornell University Press in 2021. Today, Dr. Lohse is going to speak about Prevail Until the Bitter End, German Contemplations of Complicity and Defeat in the Final War Years. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this kind introduction. I'm honored to be here. Before I begin, let me quickly state that the views I'm about to share are based on my own research and do not necessarily represent the views of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Anyway, I'm so excited to be here as part of this panel on Nazi Germany's total war period, when we find the Holocaust at its height, and we also find that German society, for the very first time, experiences the full impact of the global calamity that the Nazi regime unleashed in 1939. My research traces the roughly 2.5 years between the German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 and Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. And I'm trying to understand how ordinary German civilians and also combatants made sense of the escalating crisis of those years, what they understood about the nature and purpose of the war, how the war's descending trajectory impacted people's relationship with the Nazi regime, and what their expectations were for themselves and for the German nation at large, as the specter of defeat began to loom ever larger after 1943. To explore these and related questions, I've turned to a wide range of sources that include the usual suspects, wartime letters and diaries, as well as a large number of German surveillance materials. We know, of course, that the Nazi state party and military apparatuses were very proactive in monitoring the German population, though these fairly sophisticated and elaborate surveillance mechanisms actually began to break down under the strains of the deteriorating war effort in the later war years. What is sometimes less appreciated, though I certainly appreciate that my colleague Joel just detailed these additional sources, is that the Allies too monitored German society. They monitored not only the upper hierarchy of the Nazi apparatus, but also the German population at large, including for purposes of psychological warfare. And they generated the types of intelligence materials Joel just detailed, including secretly or transcripts of secretly monitored conversations among German POWs in Western Western Allied captivity, as well as very rich and detailed reports by Allied moles who infiltrated German society or German POW camps to get a sense of what people were talking about and what they were concerned about at various stages in the war. All of these sources, of course, pose particular challenges for historical analysis, as they were not conceptualized or created for that purpose. And certainly, I would argue that none of them individually allow us for comprehensive insights into what we might call German society at large. I would argue, nonetheless, that they're valuable sources because they capture popular voices and opinions with the candor and the detail that is quite unusual and quite rare for the time and place in which they were generated. And I would also argue that, especially when analyzed together, these sources reveal important patterns that point to ideas and perceptions that were shared widely by many German civilians and soldiers between 1943 and 1945, and that can help us today understand a little bit about how Germans made sense of their position at the intersection of extreme violence perpetrated by them and extreme violence experienced by them during the total war period. To give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm talking about, let me briefly take you to the very end of the war. Germany in the spring of 1945, when the Nazi regime orchestrated its own destruction. The continuation at that point of the war that was already lost also amounted to an act of national self-annihilation that was virtually without precedent. Traveling between Hamburg and Berlin in April and May of 1945, an OSS operative witnessed near-apocalyptic scenes. He reported at the time, the confusion in the German lines was beyond description. Corpses, dying civilians, and the stench of dead horses, burning tanks and cars were liberally strewn along the highway, end quote. During the capital under siege, he found that the, quote, ever increasing crescendo of Russian artillery had forced civilians permanently underground, where the stench of decaying bodies permeated every shelter. And yet among the sights, sounds, and smells of defeat, this OSS operative also found that hope for a German victory still flourished. According to him, quote, it was quite current to hear the Germans speaking about the impossibility of the Russians breaking through the Brandenburg Gate. The Germans could not comprehend that everything they had been told was merely a pack of lies, end quote. Evidence of such tenacious belief that a German victory was still possible, or at the very least, that Germans were facing indefinite war, not imminent defeat, could be found among the civilians staffing the home front, among soldiers in the field, and among the legions of POWs, German POWs who served or who observed the final war months from captivity. Among them was a 22-year-old Wehrmacht soldier, a university student from Berlin who had been captured in northern Italy in early 1945. He struck his British captors as, quote, not too bright and a typical product of the Nazi education system, end quote. This particular POW was despondent over Germany's dismal military situation. He believed that everyone is to blame for these misfortunes that have befallen us. Everyone, that is, but Hitler and his regime. In conversation with a fellow German POW, he pondered, if we really lost the war, but that's impossible. Hitler can't possibly be such a fool as to continue fighting if the situation really is hopeless. It would be the greatest crime he has ever committed if he did, end quote. This particular soldier did not explain what other crimes Hitler might have committed, though elsewhere in captivity, other German POWs voiced some ideas. For instance, a low-ranking German airman told his cellmate that, quote, the Führer has handed us a great deal of trouble abroad by his treatment of the Jewish question, end quote. Civilians too had notions of some of the crimes perpetrated during the war. For instance, a local party informant reported as early as October 1943. One hears often that the Jews were treated too harshly at the hands of the party. This is coming to haunt us today. By the time that Nazi and Allied morale monitors captured these and similar sentiments, many of the victims of the Holocaust had perished, though the extermination campaign continued unabated. Rumors about atrocities circulated widely among German military and civilian populations just as they embarked upon total mobilization in 1943 to stave off the turning tide of war. As Germans for the first time grappled with the possibility, however remote, of a defeat in this war, they occasionally reflected on this Jewish question, and many feared that Jewish vengeance fueled successful Allied military campaigns, including the escalating air war against German civilians. Others dreaded a post-war retribution should Germany lose the war. They anticipated that in such a case, the Allied and Jewish punishment against Germans would be brutal and merciless, and that it would mirror essentially German anti-Jewish violence in scope and method. Today, as you've heard from my colleagues earlier during this panel, we know that a trickle of evidence of German perpetrated atrocities was not only circulating in German society, but that it spilled out of Nazi-occupied Europe, beginning shortly after the German invasion of Poland in 1939. By late 1942, as we've seen just now, the Allied governments and media publicized some of these accounts of anti-Jewish atrocities or crimes against civilian populations perpetrated by the Germans. In response, the German propaganda ministry embarked upon a two-pronged counteroffensive, a two-pronged propaganda counteroffensive. On the one hand, we know that Goebbels instructed the German press to pay attention to and sensationalize accounts of Allied atrocities, were they real or imagined. And on the other, he also launched a reinvigorated domestic anti-Semitic propaganda campaign that reminded ordinary Germans of the absolute necessity to deal decisively with the Jewish people, and also impressed upon them their complicity in any such program. The logical conclusion of all of this was that a final German victory was the only way to escape, or was the only way for Germany to escape any type of retribution. By 1943, as the tide of war turned, many German civilians then shared a dread of a coming reckoning that was fanned both by Nazi and foreign propaganda, and also by the rumors and eyewitness accounts and stories spread by German soldiers on home leave and in letters. The security service in Schwabach, for instance, reported bluntly that soldiers' atrocity tales had depressed the popular mood in the area and had caused great fear, worry, and anxiety among the civilian population, because in the opinion of wide circles of the rural population, it is not certain yet that we will win the war, and the Jews will exact a terrible revenge when they return to Germany. The success of Goebbels' propaganda was particularly apparent in the seemingly widespread belief among ordinary Germans that Jews were escalating the air war to avenge their own destruction, as well as their destruction, or the destruction of their property during the Kristallnacht and other events. Such responses betray a mixture of anti-Semitic fear and loathing, but also guilt and a sense of complicity that made contemplations of the Jewish question so very fraught for many Germans in the final war years. A fear of a national reckoning in case of a German defeat also permeated some of the POW camps and prisons operated by the Western Allies as early as 1943. Frequently, soldiers in their conversations amongst themselves expressed worries that their enemies, be they Russian, Poles, or Jews, would exact a terrible revenge for the war that Germany had waged against them. As the Wehrmacht colonel, for instance, put it after his capture at Tunisia in 1943, Germany's last chance is to win this war. If we do not win it, then there will be no more Adolf Hitler. And if the Allies are able to carry out their plans, then it will be all up with us. You can imagine how the Jews will triumph then. Then we shall not simply be shot, we shall die in the most brutal ways. Elsewhere too, airmen discussed the most incredible things that went on in Eastern Europe, for instance, marveling at the numbers of Jews that have been wiped out there. The men agreed that if Germany won the war, quote, then of course all will be well, but suppose things go wrong. What first drew me to this topic was the curiosity about German popular responses to the total war period that began in 1943, and that was a period unlike anything that Germans had experienced during this war, and in fact during the entire Nazi era. Most evidence today suggests that few Germans had welcomed the war when it began in 1939, but we also know that the ease and spectacle of the early conquests seduced many. Moreover, during those early war years, many Germans remained quite sheltered from the brutal realities of the conflagration. Germany's military casualties were fairly low. Germany still largely controlled its own airspace, and civilians did not yet suffer from the burdens of mobilization, total mobilization, or from the burdens of the Allied aerial bombing that would mark accounts of later phases of the war. For those Germans who fit into the national community as envisioned by the Nazi regime, the early war years could even be marked by increased social mobility and prosperity as the regime plundered the entire continent to keep its own people well fed and content. In other words, then, the early war years, and of course I'm making very broad generalizations here, the early war years demanded relatively few sacrifices of many Germans, while offering them many spoils. Following the German defeat at Stalingrad and subsequent efforts by the Nazi regime at total mobilization, these conditions reversed to some extent. Many Germans experienced the defeat at Stalingrad as a shock and resented the inequities and growing burdens of the total mobilization period that followed. By 1944, when the German nation began to suffer a catastrophic bloodletting, many Germans considered the continuation of the war a matter of national self-preservation. They were still waiting for the vaunted miracle, or the Wunderwaffe and whatever, which itself was a figment of Nazi propaganda, and they were stunned when defeat came instead in 1945. I made a lot of broad generalizations here, and of course today we know that time and place mattered significantly in how ordinary Germans experienced the prolonged dissolution of the Third Reich between 1943 and 1945. We know too that choice and contingency accounted for fairly dramatically different wartime experiences in the many theaters of war, including the home front. However, what has surprised me in my research was that no matter where they lived or fought, Germans told surprisingly similar stories to make sense of their world in crisis. And even stories and narratives of vastly different wartime experiences could be accommodated against this all-encompassing setting of war or total war in the final war years. In this paper today, I focused on emerging Holocaust representations, myths, and alibis that emerged under these specific conditions of total war. The available evidence, as I suggested, points to the fact that between 1943 and 1945, information about mass murder and atrocities circulated widely among German soldiers, even those serving in the Western and Southern theaters of the war. and among civilians at the home front. These types of Allied surveillance and monitoring records that I pointed to show that there were vivid descriptions of the sights and sounds and smells of mass murder and atrocity that circulated among ordinary participants in this war, and that flowed from the military to the civilian population, where they then mingled with additional information gleaned from Nazi and Allied propaganda. If information on industrial killing methods remained fairly scarce, the events of what historians now often refer to as the Holocaust by bullet were not an uncommon topic of conversation, both among soldiers and civilians in those years. In these discussions, and against the backdrop of an increasingly exacting war with more and more tenuous outcomes, German perpetrator and bystanders and witnesses occasionally framed mass shootings of Jewish victims and of other civilian populations as legitimate acts of war. However, more frequently, they matter-of-factly acknowledged that these mass killings occurred under the cover of war, and that they were perpetrated by distinct segments of the German military population, usually the SS. As we know, this is a type of very pervasive alibi that persisted in German society for decades after the war. However, and this is my final point, just as Germans, whether as perpetrators, bystanders, or other witnesses, were grappling in whatever limited form with their own culpability in these mass atrocities, in genocidal actions, in this extraordinary war, they also began to experience the full impact and began to imagine themselves as future victims of this war. And conversely, they imagined their own victims, usually the Jews, as future perpetrators of crimes against the German nation. Interestingly enough, then, as the tide of war turned against Germany and as the conflict became ever more lethal and destructive for Germans, many considered the continuation of the war ever more urgent. War for them constituted not only a setting that provided or a setting for atrocities and a setting for the war against the Jews and others, it also was a setting that provided the only real protections that Germans imagined they had from the consequences of the mass killings that were perpetrated by the Germans during those years. This included counter-atrocities and other acts of revenge that Germans imagined would be pursued by their victims, their descendants, and/or their henchmen after the defeat, and that help us understand a little bit about why Germans were very unwilling to grapple with any of these issues during the war and then, of course, in the later decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to all our three speakers for fascinating lectures. As you can see in the chat, we have a list of questions here, and I'll try to present them all to you, and of course, give the opportunity to our speakers to respond. What we will do, because we are short in time, I think I'd like to ask to pose all the questions to our speakers, which means we're gonna make one round. And of course, provide the opportunity to answer, and afterwards we will conclude, of course, with Boaz, your final words. So first, 3 or 4 questions I think we have for Professor Thomas Weber. Question number 1 from Shmuel Yerushalmi. I'd like to ask Thomas. Do you see any nexus, any connection between Shoah and Versailles Conference and hard social situation in Germany in result of reparation, Versailles Conference enforced on Germany? In other words, is there a need to see any social nexus of Shoah? I don't know if I managed to read through what he really meant here, but I think I hope it's understandable. If not, I will repeat. This is question number 1, the relations between Versailles Conference and the Holocaust. Second question goes also to Thomas. It's not a question, it's more a comment with regards to replacement theory. It's a note that Nisan Hershkovitz wrote. I note the timelessness of this canard, the will to replace the natives from their own land with fifth column Israelite assistance. Maybe Nisan, if you'd like to tell us more what you meant, it would be helpful. Boaz Cohen posed a question to Professor Weber. You drew a direct line between Hitler's view to the final solution. Was this line apparent in the 1939-1940 campaigns? We usually see a nexus of anti-Semitism and war plans in the preparation of Barbarossa, but not before, or are we wrong? This was a question by Dr. Cohen. And before these are the questions for Thomas, and I'd like, if I may, also conclude with a question of my own, and then I'll proceed to the questions for Joel. Thomas, you talked about, if I understood correctly, you talked a lot about the rationality of or how Hitler tried to rationalize the whole idea of existential crisis and the need to find a solution which brought to the final solution. It's some kind of a strange logic that he had. And my question is, how much was it shared with his commanders? I mean, do you refer mostly to Hitler as a persona? This is the way he saw he perceived what was going on, his understanding of reality. How much was it shared with SS commanders? I mean, we know, all of us know, of course, the Himmler's speech in Posen, 1943, which sounds very similar to what you were trying to say about Hitler's trying to explain to the people why we're doing what we're doing. Himmler did the same also in his speech in 1943 to SS commanders. And I'm really trying to understand, was it shared by all commanders, by Heinrich, by Eichmann, or was it really only Himmler? This is a question that I was really interested in hearing your opinion about this. Next questions goes to Joel. What can you tell us about the decision not to bomb Auschwitz? Was there a discussion on this? This is question number one. Another question for Joel. What do you think of the claim by some Hungarian historians that exit politics by OSS and Hungary were deliberately encouraged by the American government to cause German invasion when the Americans had no intention of concluding a separate surrender with Hungary? Another remark to Joel, you mentioned about caution in evaluation of Nazi atrocities by the Allies. And we should also remember the experience of World War I, when numerous atrocity stories circulated at the time, at the end of the proved as fake news. This was a comment to Joel. Another question by Boaz to Alexandra now. Do you see the talk about the Jews as some sort of moral remorse, or as a reevaluation of choices, or as just another manifestation of anti-Semitism? And I see here another question for Alexandra. I would like to ask a question about the psychological moral status of the SD and SS men implicated in mass murder. We know the experience of the Eastern Front represented a new passage on the extermination, since it seemed by the official report that the bloody way to carry on the final solution by mass shootings had harsh consequences on their own mental wealth. But the perpetrators never stopped to use bullets and mass executions as a way to proceed, as shown in Poland. So do you think, what do you think was the psychological reason? I think I don't really understand what you ask here. Do you think was a psychological reason a real trouble for the SS. I think we stop here because there are many, many questions, and I'd really like to give our speaker a chance to respond. We start with Thomas,
Thank you so much.
and we will proceed. Thank you.
And maybe also quickly add the question, which I think I was just entered by Christian Hansen, who said Hitler also openly acknowledged the tactical nature of the anti-Semitic theme. He theorized that the focus on a single enemy, the Jews, was most effective for mass agitation. To what extent may the Holocaust be seen in this light? I personally think the Holocaust does not fit here because, and the reason why I think that this is not about tactical nature, because anti-Semitism is the one theme where, or one topic where Hitler tended to sound more radical in private than in public. Because in public, he often actually exaggerated certain themes, but as far as the Jews were concerned, things worked in reverse. As far as the question on Versailles is concerned, if I understood the question correctly, my answer would be to say that as far as Hitler is concerned, the nexus between Versailles and what happened later is very close, but in a different way from the way that we normally look at it. This is for me not a question about was this too harsh or whatever else, but rather that the Versailles Treaty marked for Hitler a realization of defeat, a delayed realization of defeat. A lot of Germans hadn't really realized after the end of the war, of the First World War, that Germany really had lost. And once the Versailles Treaty happened and was and was then actually also agreed by the Germans, that really marked for Hitler the realization of defeat. And I think in that sense, it was kind of the origins of his politicization. But again, this is less a kind of emotional issue. This is less a question, is this too harsh or whatever. I think as far as Hitler is concerned, is that, well, in a way, it's not a surprise that that is what the victor powers would do. So we need to understand the structural reasons for our weakness to overcome this. But of course, you could also ask the question, which maybe it has more broadly, not with just regards to Hitler, but more broadly with Germans and grassroots perpetrators, and ask whether there is a social nexus. And I said, there, I guess it becomes more complicated, and there might well be one. I'm not sure whether I quite understood the comment about replacement theory. If I understand it correctly, the indication here is about the role of Jews in replacement theory and other historical contexts, but I'm not sure whether that context would also, whether this would also apply to the Holocaust and the Third Reich, because in the imagination of Hitler and other Nazis, there was no idea that somehow the Germans would be replaced with someone else, but rather that that the Jews would, like leeches, exploit the host nations and would just generally destroy their hosts. But if I misunderstood you correctly, please correct me, and I'd be happy to respond to that. Then, as with regards to your question, to Adi's questions, it's an excellent one, but of course also really difficult to answer because there's so many different people, and of course, inevitably, once you have an aggregate of behavior, or if you have an aggregate of individual motivations, they cannot possibly all be the same. But having said that, I still think that this kind of crisis perception and crisis talk played a role for a large number of people. Maybe not necessarily in terms of originally turning people towards anti-Semitism. I think in some cases, even with people like Himmler or Heydrich, we have got to ask ourselves, and certainly with Goebbels, we have to ask ourselves whether there's at least initially an opportunistic element to it, because in a way it's kind of weird how neither of the three men initially start out as being anti-Semitic, and they turn towards anti-Semitism for reasons which I think which is a politicization process that is different from Hitler's, But that, of course, does not preclude the possibility that once they are radicalized, that they start to internalize these ideas. And certainly, I think it would apply to a large number of certainly commanders, but also of grassroots perpetrators. In a way, this goes back to what I also said about crisis perception in Germany more generally, but I also have to, I mean, as you can see, I'm giving here rather a tentative answer here. And in a way, this is really, even the article, or rather the work that I'm presenting is really new work. And I think I would have to think about this more systematically, to actually see, or not systematically, I mean, kind of empirically really go through perpetrator by perpetrator to see but the extent to which this is being played out in the same way. So thank you for that question. And I know I'm out of questions, but if I just very briefly may kind of trespass onto the next topic, because this is actually, I'm currently working on a manuscript written by the head of British Air Intelligence in the Second World War, of his memoirs that have been unpublished. And what becomes clear from that, as with regards to the question of the bombing or the non-bombing of Auschwitz, is not only what they said that they believed, i.e. that it's just not kind of feasible, but that there are real motivations as to why they were hesitant to bomb Auschwitz might be different, and that they may have conveniently used the claim that it just couldn't be done because that was the one that they could use most easily and most effectively with Churchill and Eden. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Thomas. Joe, please.
Okay. I'll start actually from the last comment by my colleague Leonid Lane about past experiences of World War I as affecting evaluation and judgment of intelligence officials in World War II. This is a common phenomenon among within intelligence communities throughout the ages. If Egypt did something in 1967, then Israel expects them in 1973 to do the same thing. So yes, absolutely. Stories that turned out to be exaggerations or propaganda in World War I indeed affected judgment in World War II. I mean, and also in some cases, I know there were, I'm aware of quotes of several officials in the British Foreign Office regarding to certain stories as Bolshevik propaganda, particularly when stories started coming out about massacres on the Eastern Front. So this is a known problem. Particularly, I think it's even in this case even more problematic when you have professional intelligence officers, Easternites of low rank, and we're in a sense looking for answers from them or even accusing them in the way and expecting them to be able to comprehend in real time what some historians refer to as a unique event or an unprecedented event. I think that sometimes just simply it might be perhaps beyond their capabilities, particularly when they often are supposed to analyze a certain event based on past events. So yes, absolutely, I agree with you on that. The second question about Hungary, I'm sorry, I'm just not familiar with this. I did not research this topic and I don't really have anything to add about it. The bombing of Auschwitz, I was hoping I actually wouldn't be asked about this. This is a very common topic. It has, it's constructed from various variables, political, moral, tactical, and also there's also the intelligence perspective. I will say two things. First of all, British intelligence knew of the existence of a concentration camp in Auschwitz from early on, from 1940. I believe they actually even received early on in 1941 a request by the Polish government in exile. They received a request to actually bomb the camp at the time and were turned down as well. What they didn't realize to a very late stage was that that place is also an extermination camp. And I would also, you have to understand that very often various fragmentary reports are reaching different units or divisions within the intelligence community that may necessarily not be communicating with each other. I know we often refer to Velba Wetzles Polt, but that wasn't necessarily useful for the intelligence community. There's also, I know, often we see the aerial photos of Auschwitz taken in 1944. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, these photos actually weren't analyzed till 1979 by a former OSS official. So in fact, I'm not really sure if there was enough intelligence till a relatively late stage to actually carry out such a mission, and I'm not going into the operational aspects of this. But
Are you done, Joe?
yeah, I think I am.
Great. I'll just go quick on the question of whether Germans reevaluated what happened to the Jews and perhaps showed remorse or had some kind of moral reckoning. Again, I'm making very broad generalizations here, to which there are, I'm sure, 1,000 exceptions. The sources I have seen reveal most strongly a self-preoccupation among Germans in the final war years with their own suffering and with fear of what's to come and what's to become of the German nation. It is in that context that they speak about regret about how the Jewish question has been handled, how Jews have been abused, murdered, and robbed by the Germans during the Nazi era. It's very rarely a reflection of an understanding of an ultimate wrong, but really a fear that the prior German action have set into motions, events that will resolve in a terrible punishment for the Germans. And as to the question of SS experiences, I'm not an expert on the perpetrators of these mass shooting actions per se. So really, I can only speak to how non-SS personnel in British captivity or Western Allied captivity spoke about those. They identified as SS men and others in special police units who they identified as perpetrators of these mass shooting units. And there was a sort of broad acknowledgement that these mass shootings were taking place. And there was also a palpable relief when you read these transcripts. There's almost a palpable relief that German military personnel can point to a particular identifiable group among the Germans who they can claim perpetrated these worst atrocities and war crimes. So that already during the war, you find a sort of self-identification by German soldiers as people who conducted a regular conventional war, and this othering of the SS, who they blame for the perpetration of war crimes and others. And again, it's an alibi that I think people were very relieved to have to start developing during war, and is one that they continue to hang on to for many decades after the end of the war. Thank you.
Three speakers, many thanks for brilliant, fascinating lectures, which I'm sure only open doors to more discussions such as this one tonight. I'd like to give the stage to Dr. Boaz Cohen for final words, please.
Thank you. Thanks to all the team who stands behind this, and thanks to the speakers, which indeed delivered the promise of a fascinating and mind-opening discussion. I would like to add something to the issue that we talked about, that Alexandra talked about. I was teaching my students, we were talking about the mass bombing of Germany. And there's the Hamburg bombing, which was really traumatic in 1943. and people were talking about the Jews. The same sort of talk like Alexandra has told us. So at first I thought, wow, they see some sort of moral reckoning. We heard the Jews, now we are paying. And then I understood that it's totally different. The Allies, the British, the Americans, they would never do such a thing like bombard Hamburg and kill 30,000 people, whatever. I don't remember the exact number. They would never do such. It's the Jews. And the Jews are now committing revenge, which, by the way, brings us to the old Christian anti-Semitic tropes. It's about the vengeful Jews. So actually, whatever happens, it strengthens existing anti-Semitic beliefs. So all this talk about we should have done this differently, it's all about, it brings you all the time back to the regular anti-Semitic position that we can see permeating German society in this case. This is one thing. The other thing is we had a discussion with Yaron, which gave an excellent opening. Are we going to do every month, like January 43, February 41, or whatever, every time? No, we did do a June 42 event, and we did do now a January 1943 Total War event, which I think was very good, is very good. But we actually, when I was in the Beyond Camps conference last week and met 90 Holocaust scholars face to face, turns out that what we do have here is the ability to do niche subjects. Things that you will not organize a major workshop and fly in people from all over the world, but we can fly in through the internet, an amazing team from three continents, and do together such such an evening, and people are coming to listen. So this is really, when we see this, we understand that we are doing the right thing, and we are also open to new ideas if anyone has something he wants to offer. What I want to do to conclude is to share my screen. If there are any of you that didn't get any mail about this innovation course, then we are doing this again. We have a few weeks for registration left for the course. We already have people from 4 continents that registered. This is an amazing course where we teach how to do memory startups on Holocaust memory. We teach tools of Startup Nation from the best in the field in Israel. We teach from conceptualizing a project to making a business plan. We do this in international teams this is a project-based learning course. It's open to everyone, actually. It's open to students, faculty, people who are committed to this subject and want to learn more tools. You need an ability to work with other people because you don't do startups as a single person. It has to be, we are building teams. Teams are coalescing in the course, and each one is building a project. In the end, we have, to the best tradition of the high-tech world, we have a pitch. Last time we had the judges or the commentators were Danny Dan from Yad Vashem, Yigal Cohen from the CEO of Ghetto Fighters, and someone from the pharma industry, who is running the biggest pharma labs in Israel. And we are really open, still can accept, we don't charge tuition, but we do charge registration. But once you are accepted after an interview, then you are in. So if you have students, friends, yourself interested in this, be in touch, take a photo of the barcode of your screen, then you can check it later on your phone, but you can also just be in touch with us and we'll send you the right links. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks again for the organizer. Thank you for the speakers. I'm always learning so much in such an evening, so really thank you. I think we are really doing something good here. So good night and see you next time. Next time, a seminar with a workshop with 2 panels and Ward as a keynote speaker on children after the Holocaust, bringing together historians and practitioners working today with children from war zones. As our best tradition of children in crisis workshops, this will be Children in Crisis 7. We will bring together historians of rehabilitation and people doing rehabilitation today. So see you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night,
Good night,
everybody.
everybody.
Good night.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye-bye.